Eleanor Billington. I'm leaving my house, right? John and our son already out in the fields. I'm getting the logs as one doff, mine being my own, when those three steely faces turn to me. Oh, their chaste little bosoms, their pious little smiles, women who think they are better than us, servants. But we weren't their servants, nay, not any longer. 1 year out of indentured servitude, but watching them look at me, you never know it. I took enough of those glances in London. I shan't be needing them now, mistresses, I yelled across the garden. Alice, the governor's wife, covered her chest. Susanna put her hand on her hip. Elizabeth went back to her weed pulling. Revelry it was to rile them. Sing for your supper? That is what my mum did, sang for her bloody supper, and I did what I had to do. Did I not? Given how we lived on the Mayflower, on the wet ship floor with the rats nibbling our toes, he should have paid us. When my feet first fell upon this land, I had in mind to return to the ship's master and say, take me back? We agreed to 7 years of labor with respectable, ordinary English people. We agreed to 7 years of servitude in Virginia, not Plymouth. But oh no, William Bradford had an answer. My kind, my common kind, we are never given what we are promised.
TaraShea Nesbit joins us this evening in celebration of her new novel, Beheld. TaraShea's writing has been featured in a number of publications, and Beheld is her second novel. TaraShea Nesbit is an assistant professor of nonfiction and fiction at Miami University in Ohio. Please join me in welcoming TaraShea for our time together this evening. I'm Kristen Motti. I'm from the Adult Programs team at the Boston Public Library. We were supposed to have TaraShea join us for an author talk in person in March, and I'm just so glad to join together with Margaret and American Ancestors, and that we were able to have this time together with TaraShea tonight.
I'm Margaret Talgett, and I'm a director at the American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society. I'm also the curator of the American Inspiration Author Series, our in-person event series that takes place at our headquarters at 99 to 101 Newbury Street in Boston. It is such a thrill to have so many of you with us tonight from all over the country. We are a broad-based organization of 260,000 members, and so many of you are not here in Boston, and it's a real thrill that you could be with us online tonight. There's so much we can do online, and Tara, thank you for being here. I look forward to having some question and answer time with you.
Well, what I'm really curious about, Tara, is you're in Ohio, and this is such a fantastic Plymouth-based, local-based story. It is the 400th anniversary of Plymouth, the founding this year. So maybe you could speak to your inspirations for writing Beheld and how this all came together for you.
Yes, I'd love to. And thank you, Kristen and Margaret and Annie and the library and the American Ancestors. I'm so happy to be here with you, and saddened that I can't be with you in this way, but in the other way, but this way is wonderful. So how this story came about, I had just finished my first novel, The Wives of Los Alamos, and that book tells the story of the making of the atomic bomb, but from the perspective of the nuclear scientist wives' perspective. And so I knew that I was fascinated with American history and turning points in American history, particularly how it relates to power and how we build communities, but how we can there are vying interests in how communities are made. So I was in a PhD program. I was finishing up my coursework, and I took a class on early American literature. And that's where I first read William Bradford on Plymouth Plantation. And I was just so interested in how that time period was so much different than what I thought I knew, right? So like my K-12 education told me the Mayflower pilgrims, religious freedom coming from England. And I had, because I grew up in Ohio, probably partly, and not the East Coast, where some people, you go to Plymouth Plantation as part of your education, your childhood education. I had a lot of misconceptions, but I was really interested in the language, the way that there were these phrases like God's back part the way that religion and science are kind of working together. There's a sense of signs, you know, all of this. But specifically, I was reading his book, and there was a footnote that said, William Bradford, though he mentions the cause of death, the number of people that passed away and the causes of death that first winter, he very little, he just passes through what happened to his first wife, Dorothy. And I was really interested in what that could have meant, and was he experiencing deep grief and couldn't really communicate that? He was also writing it from a third person plural perspective. So thinking about all the ways that he was operating to leave some of the detail out of that story. And I didn't want to write the novel at that point because I felt really haunted by this woman's voice. But I also thought, I know, you know, I don't know if they use forks. Like, how am I going to be able to write? And, you know, like, what's that dinner scene look like? But more importantly, how did their worldview shape their thinking, and how they think of self is different than how we think of self in some ways. But I was haunted, and I couldn't let go of it. So I kept writing this Mayflower ship thing. And then I was doing more research, and it was in that process that I learned things like Phineas Pratt saying that that first winter bodies were propped up along by trees as a forest sentinel. And then I thought about, and then I learned all these things about economics of like debt and what that would mean. And so I was doing all this research and went into that. And then I came across in the Plymouth court records that mention of the first murder trial. And I don't want to give a spoiler, but I will say that the first, if you don't know that trial, that first murder trial in Plymouth features a person who also features disparagingly in Bradford's book. So I started to see these parallels of conversation, and I wanted to write into those gaps. And so I wondered, like, what could have happened to Dorothy? What could have made this murder take place and this particular murder trial happen? And what were the factions that were happening within the community? And I found out so many fascinating things. And it's like the ministers that were asked to leave Plymouth, well, just so many details. But when I found places where the evidence conflicted, so there'd be two different kinds of stories for the same event, I started to feel a little freed up to write fiction. And so I think I'm having a conversation with the past about who these Mayflower passengers were and what was their effect on the northeastern woodlands, both the land and the people. So there's so much research that I did that I don't want to bore you, but I will say, I'm wondering how many people actually have a Mayflower ancestor connection. And I know there are a few people on my screen, so if you could raise your hand if you're a Mayflower, you know, if you have Mayflower ancestry. But if you're not and you want to type in the chat, you know, maybe it would be fun to see how many of you out there can go back that far. But of all the research I did, the most fun, part of the most fun was when I was living in Worcester, Massachusetts for a summer, and I was doing research at the American Antiquarian Society. And I had a 6-week-old baby and a 3-year-old daughter and my husband. And it was near the end of the research process. I'd already been to Plymouth and spent time in Massachusetts during various trips. But I was coming back for a kind of final like conversation, being present in the space. And so we went to Plymouth Plantation, and my 6-week-old had a blowout. Sorry, I'm just going to tell you this story. So we're at Plymouth Plantation. We're in the village. We're like moving down from the meeting house, and we are starting to come into the community, into the houses. My 6-week-old has a blowout. And I lay him down, and many of you have probably been to Plymouth Plantation, so you understand that there are chickens and other kinds of animals around. So I lay him down and I open his diaper, and the chickens start swarming, like, and because I guess I think it's food, and I'm so scared. So I pick him up like this, and my daughter is clinging to me because she's been bitten by a grandmother's chicken once, and she's scared. And I call for my husband, and I say, Jared! And he's over talking to William Bradford about whittling, and the actor. And this woman steps out of her house and says, "Would you like some help, mistress?" And I say, yes, I would. And my husband comes and he says no, because he's thinking about how we're going to ruin this period materials and details. So I find a stroller, I get back to our stroller, I lay the baby down, I'm changing the diaper, and then meanwhile, 2 chickens begin to fornicate. And the woman that plays Eleanor Billington, who is a lead figure in my novel, and she is as I've imagined her, though I don't have full evidence on this, as I imagined her, she had been an indentured servant. And so she comes from a different group. But in this living history museum, she steps out, she offers her bed. The chickens are fornicating. My husband says, "That's unholy." And Eleanor Billington says, "They're just doing what cocks do, master." And there's something about having the chance to meet your character in an environment that you had not imagined that was just hilarious and wonderful. And if that woman is out there, I just want to tell you, like, you're a really great living history museum person, and I love what's happening in Plymouth Citation to make the unexpected happen in that space. So it looks, 23 hands. My husband and I have made, it's wonderful to see how many of you out there are in that kind of grouping. I can tell you a little bit more about the process and what I uncovered as I was working through it.
TaraShea, we did have a lot of questions about process, and you did touch upon this a little bit, but also how you maybe you could speak a little bit more about how you stepped off from the facts to the fiction, and the sources that you used, and then where you did touch upon this a little bit, but how did you move through that process?
Yeah, thank you. That's such a good question. It really was, when I wrote The Wives of Los Alamos, I was pulling from oral histories collected by historians about women talking about their time in Los Alamos. So I had all of this material. But when I went to write Beheld, I had a picture of a felted beaver hat, Dorothy Bradford's signature. I mean, I didn't personally have it, but one could go to a museum and see it. Dorothy Bradford's signature on her marriage certificate, and no letters and no diaries. And I was trying to work around, it's Susan Howe says, "If you are a woman, it is in the gaps and silences where you find yourself." And this seemed very much true for this time period. And so I was trying to work around and find where I could see the women's presence, even though I couldn't see it written or be their personal story. So it was a messy process. I wrote a first draft that is entirely from the perspective of Dorothy Bradford, and she's on the ship and she's leaving behind. One of the first things I started to put together was that she was leaving behind her son. She left her son in Holland, a young son, and she didn't have other children, but a lot of other people that were on the ship had a lot of other children. So I could imagine a space where here's a woman who probably wanted more children, but something was making that not happen, and probably a woman that was grieving her own son when she gets on the ship. And as many of you know, there were multiple delays. They arrived much later than they anticipated. And it's on that moored Mayflower ship that she perishes, and her husband is out scouting land and comes back to hear that story. So the first draft of my novel really was that timeline, but I really wasn't right. It became hard to tell the story from the perspective of someone who passes away, and I didn't feel like it had the emotional range. And the more I read and came to understand early American history, the more I thought I need to be offering a lot of countering views here. I need to have a lot of different perspectives rather than just hers. And I had a personal loss that kind of made the grieving I was writing for her really, unfortunately, overlap with the grieving that I then did. And then when I came back to writing the second draft, I took a much cooler third person perspective and had multiple people, but I was still on the ship. And then it was a third draft after I had gone to London for summer and done more research that I heard Eleanor Billington's voice. And I spent a lot of time in court records and looking around those gaps. What were the laws? Because usually laws indicate that a threshold was crossed in which one has to say, don't do that. So what were the laws that were made? And then what were the court cases that came through? And from that, it was like, that was about 4 years into research and writing, and I continued to write. And at that point, I felt like, okay, I won't be able to get veracity, which is difficult in the best of times, because what a person will tell a historian for the historical record is complicated by how they want to be seen and various other things. But for this time period, I'm not going to get veracity, but I can at least try to get at the ways it might have felt, or like, what were the trees like? What are the ways that people were grieving and loving and hungry, and all of these things. And so in thinking more of it as a conversation rather than giving a definitive view, that draft came a lot easier. And then I did had a lot of conversations with historians and scholars and knowledge holders about the draft when I was towards the end of it, once I had written it early on, and then coming back at the end and revised from there too.
I love your use of the word voices, because that's really what these women become in your work, and you can hear them and be with them. And I just wanted to share some voices from our Q&A. Nancy's written in, I have 7 passengers on the Mayflower in my ancestry, both saints and strangers. One of them was an indentured servant. I have another Margaret asking, what is the story of Alice Carpenter and Bradford's romance? And I, these are voices that are still with so many of us. Did you have any comment on those comments?
Yes, I love, Nancy, that you have so many connections, and also I really want to talk to you about your indentured servant connection. That was an aspect, 20 by my calculations, 20, and I'm not a mathematician, but 20 to 25% of the people aboard were in a kind of servitude, from the very youngest, the 4-year-old Moore siblings. So they were like 4 siblings that were sent away by their father without their mother's knowledge, which is an amazing backstory that I wrote around, but it never got back in, and which I'd be happy to talk about. But they were indentured servants from the age of 4 up until like male adulthood. And so that potential class difference and power difference was present, but I hadn't been aware of it until I did a bit of research and thought, what is around here that I hadn't heard about? Now, your question about Alice, I wondered the same thing myself, because they knew one another for a long time, and he married Dorothy, but what would it have? And also, I think this is somewhat common that people pass away and then you marry the really close person, the other close person too. But I thought, I wondered if there was any kind of kindling there between them when they were in Holland, and how he decided to choose Dorothy and then Hall for Alice. It seems like there could have been something there, which is what I do. I do sort of suggest that a bit in the novel, because it felt quite possible to be there.
Fantastic.
Great, thank you. So we have another question about writing, looking ahead, and this time period. Is there something about this time period that you want to explore further and set more work in this time period, or was this it, and will you explore something else as far as time periods go in your next work?
Yeah, I won't take it off the table. I think that it's hard to let go if you've spent so much time with something, that like spending so much time with the place and with the real and imagined people, and and all of that, the stories that I know that I haven't shared, or the things that I've imagined when I know. So I could see that happening, but I don't think it will be the next project. I do think that I love history so much, and I love thinking about how communities are working and how power is operating. And every time I go back to a story I thought I knew, I find so many different things. And so I don't know what the next one will be, but first one, the bomb, this one, the Mayflower passengers, and I think I'll probably go further west, but we'll see.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
In terms of your personal reading and what inspires you in your off moments, I mean, as a writer, maybe you don't feel that you have off moments, you're constantly getting in material, but yeah. What, your book is very lyrical and beautiful, and it is a work of fiction. And I was wondering what fiction you read, how do you mix it in with reading nonfiction? What's on your bedside table?
Yes. Well, my reading and writing have been a bit disrupted right now, as you might imagine. And I have 2 small children that are at home, and I also teach. But I do get in a little bit of reading every night. And I have been reading Susan Sontag's Illness as Metaphor. So I've been really deep into thinking about illness and vaccine and all of those things that I think a lot of us are thinking about. Also looking back at Ulysses on immunity, which is even more stunning the 3rd time I've read it. And I'm looking over here because I should say that I'm reading a lot of nonfiction, and I do that. I really do read more nonfiction. I love old diaries. Michael Wigglesworth is just a delight. Like, so older diaries as well as newer ones. I'm such a snoop, and right now I'm reading Natalie Ginsburg's The Little Virtues, which I very much love. And I'm also reading a couple contemporary writers, that debut writers that have new books out. This is Megan Giddings Lakewood, and it's really timely right now because it's from the perspective of a woman who, her family is, there's an illness in the family and she has to leave college, and she goes home and she enlists in this secret experimental medical testing in order to help the family out. So the way that it's working with the medical world is and very interesting. And then this one, Barker House by David Maloney, who's a Massachusetts, I'm not sure if he's in Boston, but he is in Massachusetts, a Massachusetts-based debut writer. And this book is about a corrections officer. It's about a set of people that are working in corrections, and it's exploring grief and masculinity, and it's really wonderful. So that's it, nonfiction and some debut writers. I do love a lyric. I mean, I do love a poet that is turned into a fiction writer, for sure. That is such a soft spot. But I'm not reading one of those right now. I recently finished Yun Lee's Where Reasons End, and that was just beautiful.
It's a nice balance. We do have another question for you about going back to Beheld. Someone in our audience would like to have you talk a little bit more about how people became indentured servants and how that whole class system worked in colonial Plymouth, and if you could address that a little bit more, and how you based your characters in those roles.
Yeah. So when looking at I read, there's a good book on this, which is not my memory right now, but I read a book and several articles on white indentured servitude, I think is what it was called. And it, starting with that book, The History of, it's not The History of White People, which is a book that I really like, Nell Painter's book, but it is, something like Nell Eisenberg. It will come back to me. White Trash is the name of the book. And that has a perspective of indentured servitude in early America. And from there are links to several articles. I'm giving you that because I don't remember is the short answer. But I do know that part of the way that I was basing it on is that you would see a kind of master, and then you would see the name of a person that was listed or not given a name, which would say servant. And when I was discovering the Moore family, and that's when I really settled into understanding that there was indentured servitude. 7 years seemed to be a number that stuck with me. And then after those 7 years, you would be granted your land and your freedom. It changed over time, though. How indentured servitude operated changed over time in Plymouth and everywhere, related to what was happening economically, and it's beyond what I can recall in a response right now. But I do know that it shifted when I was in conversation with a knowledge holder, a member of the Wampanoag Nation. She was telling me that there were Native Americans that were in indentured servitude willingly or unwillingly. And that, of course, grew and changed over time. But in the initial, I was just thinking the 7 years one would sign up for, which would get them their passage to a new colony. And from there, they would work, and then they would have some land.
Great, thank you.
Tara, you brought up the Wampanoag Nation. And around these parts here in the Massachusetts area, we've been thinking very much about our Four Nations celebration of the anniversary of the 400th, which has really been a thrilling year to enter. And it's sort of sad that it's been slightly disrupted by something that comes every 100 years. I mean, we're every 400 years. So going back to this 400th anniversary, how aware were you in your research and writing of coming out in this very important anniversary commemorative year?
Yeah, not at all initially. I mean, I started writing this book 5.5 or 6 years ago. And so there was no planning in terms of, oh, this could be timed with the 400th, none of that. I had written my first book, I'm somewhat sheepish to say, really rapidly. After 2 years of research, I wrote it, a draft in a couple of months, which is all to say that I was very wrong about how hard it is to finish a novel and how much research one needs to do, especially for a very important story like the thinking about this kind of origin story. So I wasn't aware at all initially, and then as the book, as I showed the book to my editor and we started thinking about dates, they chose that. But I'm really, I think, very lucky because there's so much work that all of you are doing with the 400th anniversary commemoration programming, that in some ways I wish I was coming out even a year later, because I'm selfishly like, I want to see all of these new things that you're learning and finding and sharing. And of course, it's super sad that there isn't the ability to do that face to face, at least not right now. But what's been great is that I can go on to, like, for instance, the Plymouth Plantation website and take a webinar now, which I couldn't do from Ohio unless I was in this space. So it'll be interesting to see how people who wouldn't be able to travel are able to connect in a way that they couldn't otherwise. And
I have to say that what we don't celebrate in this year that has, requires physical place, we will get to celebrating. I think it's such an important anniversary that if we can do everything possible online this year, and maybe there'll be an opportunity to celebrate a year from now, and just sort of extend it out. But your timing is so beautiful with that historical occurrence. So thank you for that answer.
Mm-hmm. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and we do have a question from the audience. And someone is asking how much research you did. You did mention visiting Plymouth Plantation with your child and that whole experience. How much research did you do into daily life? You talked about speaking to the knowledge holders and interviewing different people and consulting records. But this question is related to how much actual research did you do and how much imagination did you bring into that? And you've touched upon that a little bit, but maybe you could speak to that a little bit more. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for that. So I did, it was really, I felt like I was in a space of immersion for about 4 years of the research, and it was happening in multiple ways. Part of thinking about the daily life was like, do they have forks? Okay, forks were from Italy, you know, looking this up. Why does anyone care? I'm obsessing about forks, but it was important for me for this kind of imagining. So then I found out a lot of information about dinner services. Then I went to London, I went to England, and I was doing tours of different history in different kind of living history museums, and thinking about the home space. And like we would drink from these shared cups, these shared mugs, and this is where our gardens were. And I'd go to Plymouth Plantation and see this sense of like, okay, it's coming to understand the scale here is a lot smaller than the scale was. I would go when I went to the American Antiquarian Society, looking at maps and seeing just how populated and how many trading posts and Native American communities were already in existence. Those kinds of things were part of daily life in the way of, okay, you would actually be taking a historic trail up to this trading post site and then coming back, and that would be part of the way that you were working within the seasonal space. I read a lot about one of the first things I researched was laboring and how women gave birth with other women, right? There weren't male doctors doing much of that work. And I know very odd things now, like the birthing chairs one would sit in. And so this is like a really scattershot way of saying I did a lot, and then I would note it, and then I would try to know it enough that it could come out in a way that didn't feel as if I was trying to tell you all that I knew, right? Which is a delicate balance of, oh, I really don't want to let go of this important detail, but it doesn't fit within the characters. And so the fork thing actually did get into the space of the character, because in a portrait that I've seen of Alice Bradford, she's dark-haired, and she's in Holland, and a shopkeeper tells her she's as Italian as a fork because of the way that she looks. So you have to like subtly work those things in. So in some ways a lot, but I'm sure that like anything else, there's so much more I could know and learn, and there's so much that is hard to then emerge, and so much that everybody is still learning. Anthropologists are right now like looking, finding a piece of pottery and going, hey, what were they using that for? And that's amazing to me, that it's an ongoing conversation about how people were living every day.
Still learning, still unearthing. It continues.
Yes, for sure.
We have a request, TaraShea. I don't know if you're prepared. Would you be able to read just another small bit before we close out?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I would be happy to. I'm going to read you, yes, a part where the ship that's out at sea has just arrived, and this is from the perspective of Alice. From the chest, I pulled a blue and yellow blanket, one I believed to have been John's. I kept it at the bottom of the chest, despite all need for any warmth, because I wanted it to be as close to how he remembered it as Dorothy's son within that ship. I shook it high in the air and watched the dust motes fall like tiny stars. I pulled out the trundle bed and placed Joseph atop of it, then lifted the blanket off quickly. There's Joseph. There you are. That game that delights all children. Mercy nudged her way betwixt us, wanting the attention I was giving to her brother. Before I could admonish her, there was a knock on the door, and then the door burst open. It was Susanna. It's here, Susanna said. They are here, Elizabeth said, coming in behind her. She looked at both of us and ran out, leaving the door open. We all rushed outside. The pounding of hammers on the roofs had stopped. The light was fragile, and the air felt that way too. There was the boat, so ordinary, so small, carrying so many wishes. I started running. Watch them, I called to Elizabeth. She gave a put-out face, but stepped back into my garden. Susanna and I broke into a run, like girls, through the path, not the 40-year-old women that we were. Though my innards were as delicate as cheesecloth from birthing Joseph, and she was nearing the end of her pregnancy, still we ran. We let the momentum and the wind surge us toward the dock. So there are these little interludes that are not from the women's perspective and not from the male's perspective. And this is an interlude from nature. In summer, all that is green hushes that which is not. Sassafras bends their necks in the wind. A box turtle hatchling takes her first stride. A shrew makes a squeak only his kind can hear. A snake unhinges his jaw around the shrew. 3 white-tailed deer graze in an open field, mother, father, and child on wobbly legs. There is the flora and there is the fauna. The leaves of a fern unfurl. The petals of rose gentian, summer's arrival, pink on a yellow center, are delicate and dead on the pond shore. Dewdrops from golden aster. In the early evening, the deer too are hungry. They have survived a whole day from predators, but still there is the evening to live through. The light is low. A white-tailed deer turns her ears. The sound echoes through the trees, but in summer, the trees full and green with leaves. The sound of a musket shot is dampened. Barn owls, tawny owls, magpies, hawks, jackdaws, and snakes, all seeking food. Along the roadside, the wolf traps set out by the colonists, and the wolf pack running forward.
Beautiful. Thank you.
I don't think I've heard from nature for a really long time, especially being locked in my house this way. So I love hearing from nature, and I love hearing all these remarkable voices of women, particularly. It's been really a pleasure. And where I work at the New England Historic Genealogical Society, American Ancestors, we're all about remarkable people and remarkable families, going back to the Pilgrim era, and also, you know, back to recent immigrants and back to stories from our Jewish heritage. And I just want to say that it's really been a real thrill to have you here with us online. There's so much that all of us can do online. I was on a webinar today looking at how to access genealogical records. I've also been reading National Geographic's site, looking into space and then looking down into the ocean. But I'm really grateful to you for giving us access to Plymouth Colony in that era. And Kristen, it's been a delight working with you tonight. There's so much more to come. But I have to end on nature in this time of spring. TaraShea, thank you so much for your time. And Kristen.
Thank you. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, TaraShea. This has been a great time together. And on behalf of the Boston Public Library, I really want to thank you for coming to speak with us in this venue, even though we couldn't do it in person. And I look forward to the future collaborations that we will have with American Ancestors. Thank you. And thank you to everyone for coming and joining us.
I did put on screen all of our authors ahead, and TaraShea, maybe you'll tune in for some of them. We have a wonderful gentleman born in Vietnam who just barely got out of Saigon, coming at the end of April. Stephen Pulio coming with a history of Ireland-American relations and the first humanitarian mission there on the 14th of May. And then we have a book about DNA, Libby Copeland, coming at the end of May. So there's so much more to come. Everyone, thank you so much. And we look forward to more.